Greater Manchester Police Constable and a Greater Manchester PCSO were saved from dismissal last week after being investigated over missing cannabis and were instead given management advice. As in, don't get caught again, you silly boys. Now, this find of the vanishing cannabis was uncovered as the IOPC investigated 23 Greater Manchester police officers over counterfeit goods that had been seized but was being worn by the police. Now, obviously to you and me, this would be a case of plods dipping their hand in the cookie jar, so to speak. With mountains of counterfeit clothing being seized, it was always going to be a temptation to our good old trustworthy police forces, which led to the IOPC investigation into alleged misuse of counterfeit goods. The investigation started around 2 years ago, but it's said that the only officers who received any disciplinary action were the 2 who were picked up for the missing cannabis. The IOPC initially took action after, as said, the plod was seen wearing the counterfeit clothes and also that counterfeit clothing had been donated to charity. Probably the stuff they took that wasn't the right size, and let's face it, they couldn't exactly take it back to evidence after it had all been logged. Greater Manchester Police have said that their policy for seizing counterfeit goods was flawed and has now been robustly addressed. The Independent Office for Police Conduct has issued a series of recommendations to improve the way that Greater Manchester police officers handle property seized during the course of their work. For example, not stealing it for yourselves. The IOPC said it looked at the conduct of 23 officers involved in the acquisitions and alleged misuse of counterfeit goods during an operation in November 2019. This led to a further investigation into the acquisition, storage and alleged misuse of counterfeit goods involving a number of other officers. Now, it appears that the excuse for taking and wearing the counterfeit clothing was not because they wanted to look cool or look like they've got some money. No. Their excuse was that they wore it to blend in. Like they don't have their own civvy clothes. I mean, I know plod wish their uniform was sewn onto them for their protection, but I'm pretty damn sure that most of them do have outside work clothes that they could have worn to blend in. IOPC Regional Director Amanda Rowe said it was a very complex investigation which examined the conduct of 23 officers. No officer had a case to answer for misconduct in relation to the acquisition, storage and use of counterfeit clothing. In other words, stealing, taking home and then wearing said stolen items. Did identify individual performance issues for learning for officers and have recommended organisational learning for Greater Manchester Police in respect of its policies and procedures for handling property and managing exhibits. The lack of clarity for officers about how they should be handling and storing the items they had seized. There was no indication any had acted in breach of their relevant policies, although did identify a need for clearer guidance for officers. We recommended the force should also review and update its guidance, policies and procedures relating to seized material and all property coming into police possession, whether counterfeit or otherwise, and ensure the updated guidance is readily available to officers. During the course of the investigation, a separate matter came to light concerning the actions of 2 individuals involved in the seizure of what was believed to be a small amount of cannabis, which could not be accounted for later in the course of their duties in October. We found an officer and a PCSO had a case to answer for gross misconduct in relation to this incident. However, because their cases would have had to have been dealt with in different disciplinary tribunals, the evidence in respect of each was incapable of being dealt with in a way which was fair to both. As a result, we agreed both should receive management action in respect of allegations relating to the failure to comply with procedures around the management of property. The recommendations the IOPC made to Greater Manchester Police were: GMP should review and update force guidance, policies and procedures relating to operations that are intended to target the unlawful supply of counterfeit goods and ensure guidance on seizure, retention and disposal of material is up to date, clear and readily available to all officers. In other words, don't get caught stealing it. GMP should consider training for officers involved in operations that are intended to target the unlawful supply of counterfeit goods to ensure that they are familiar with the legal powers available to them and the force guidance, policies and procedures. In other words, don't get caught stealing them. GMP should review and update force guidance, policies and procedures relating to seized material brought into police possession and then used for a policing purpose. In other words, remind officers not to get caught stealing. GMP should review and update force guidance, policies and procedures relating to all property coming into police possession, whether counterfeit or otherwise, and ensure guidance on seizure, retention and disposal of the material is up to date, clear and readily available to all officers. In other words, you get the picture. Assistant Chief Constable Chris Sykes said, "We accept the findings of the IOPC and have robustly addressed our policy regarding the seizing of counterfeit items, which we acknowledge was not sufficient at the time of this issue coming to light in November 2019. And I'm glad that they did not come to my home and check my wardrobes. Despite no officers ultimately having a case to answer, it was right of us to refer this to the IOPC so that it could be objectively investigated and to allow the independent findings to be implemented in our written policies and procedures so that all our officers receive the necessary guidance in this area going forward. We have ensured the policing of North Manchester and particularly the Cheetham Hill area has been largely unaffected by the procedures we have needed to follow throughout this period, with a renewed neighbourhood team being quickly instated with a continued commitment to serve the local community." Now, I'm sure absolutely none of you will be surprised by either the incident itself or the outcome. When you have a sense of being able to do what the fuck you want without consequence, you will inevitably take the chance to abuse your position. The fact the IOPC nor GMP have disciplined any of these plods is quite clear in my eyes, and it has nothing to do with there being no case to answer. It's simply because 23 of them, and that's a huge chunk of police to be dealt with in one go for theft, would all have to be dismissed and would leave Greater Manchester Police up shit creek without a paddle. So this outcome is absolutely of no surprise to me whatsoever. Now, it's clear that if they were allowed to use police evidence room as a costume shop, then the IOPC would not have been called in the first place. So it's blatant that Plod stole the items but got caught, and after some panicked discussions between Chief Constable Stephen Watson and the IOPC to work out just how they're going to manage this one, they decided to come up with a procedural issue rather than a thieving plod issue. Bearing in mind that you must be a complete and utter fuckwit if you think that items that you have seized are able to go home with you.